not your first one. You've been to a few. Do we have a speaker on the run?
Yeah, he was debating leaving, but he came back.
Breaking the law, breaking the law. There he is. Okay. Okay. I'm going to not be able to sum up Kevin's entire bio in a few sentences, but for the sake of being thorough, I will give it a go. Kevin grew up in Florida, and then shortly after leaving high school, he joined the Navy, where he served aboard the USS Towers, which I had a funny dream about how we made that into a museum ship last night, but I digress. Kevin has a knack for storytelling. I'm so excited that he is our speaker tonight because Kevin really can tell a good story. It's like part of who he is as a person. So he used that knack for storytelling to go into what? What do you think you do to me? Oh, turnabouts, fair play, my friend. And where he comes back from the Navy and then he gets into broadcasting media. So another opportunity to go out there and be just another, continue being a fantastic storyteller. And so Kevin ends up in Green Bay, and the way of course he tells it better than I do, but what happened is he saw some sort of advertisement that the Door County Maritime Museum was hiring an executive director, and he was like, well, I was in the Navy. I've done some stuff. It's a good opportunity to continue telling a good story. Let's give it a go. And in September of 2018, Kevin joined us here at the Door County Maritime Museum as our executive director. Okay, big thank you to our sponsors, the Door County Medical Center and Bridgeport Resort. If you need a place to stay, I highly recommend Bridgeport. If you need a place to stay, but it's like a medical emergency, I do recommend Door County Medical Center. Please join us on January 4th, where our collections coordinator, Brennan Christensen, will be on hand to talk about the disappearance and the subsequent search for the Linda E. All right, Kevin.
Thank you, Astro. Wow, yeah. The transition from television to the museum was one from looking at a piece of glass that people would watch on their TV on the other side, simple little piece of glass, to a room full of people. And many of them who now know me well, and just by the look on their face, I'll know if I'm going along, saying something silly, and we'll find our way there. What?
I got to interrupt for a second. Can everybody hear him? No. I didn't think so. We're gonna fix it.
Okay. I could scream at everybody.
Don't do that.
I won't do that.
You need a voice.
I will say, while we're waiting, when I found this photograph, digging around and trying to learn everything I could about ships that were built here and what happened in this community, this picture took me away from my day's work for quite some time. It's not often you see the color photographs of what happened that day. Go in there and get Sam's. He's in there. He might not come out. There's so much going on in that photograph. The leaning superstructure, I can hold it. I don't need to stand. Is the Arizona. And for the life of me, on the 20 minutes I went down this rabbit hole, I could not identify which ship that was in the foreground. Hello, hello? Yes, no. But there's people doing everything in this photograph. There are people manning machine guns, shooting at aircraft. There's people floating in the water. There's wounded people hanging on to debris. This picture just really summarized what happened that day, to me at least, and I thought it deserved to be the picture we begin with. Is it working yet? I thought I spoke loud enough.
I mean, if I can't hear you from the back, people can't hear you.
How old does he think I am? Thank you, Sam. I appreciate this. You can hear me now? Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, today, as you know, is the 82nd anniversary
of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's been several weeks of piecing together, looking at, I keep pushing the wrong button here. I will get it. The history of almost every single ship that was built here in World War II. Tonight, I like to tell stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And tonight is really uncomfortable for me because what we're going to have is just a lot of separate little stories. Separate little stories about what happened in this community. And it was not lost on me that I'm speaking to people who were here, younger, and have heard stories themselves. And hopefully I'll get through this in the 35 minutes I timed it out for. So if you have anything to add, I'd love to hear it. I also went down what we call in the museum business, a lot of rabbit holes, where I would spend half a day trying to figure out why this ship was there doing that. And a lot of those didn't make the cut to fit it in the first part. But if we get done quickly enough, I can zip through those slides real quick and tell you those stories. But that's if we have time. So we'll just move ahead. In every list of ships from Pearl Harbor that day, none were from here, none were built here. And it's a shame. There's one ship with a similar name to a vessel that was remodeled here, but it's not the same ship. But there were a lot of people from Sturgeon Bay and Door County that were there. And tonight we'll tell a little bit about some of those folks. I didn't know at the beginning of this project that the captain of the Arizona grew up in Milwaukee. So in case you weren't aware of that, I thought I would touch on that. He went to Eastside High School in Milwaukee, received an appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. And his name is Franklin Van Valkenburg. In the weeks before the attack, the Arizona was going out, doing drills and patrols outside of Pearl Harbor, and then they'd come back on the weekends and spend some time doing some maintenance and getting ready. A few weeks before the attack, he wrote a letter home to Wisconsin to his cousin. And you can see on the screen what he said. While we're out, our eyes are constantly trained westward. We keep the guns ready for instant use against aircraft or submarines whenever we are at sea. We have no intention of being caught napping. That's while they were at sea. We all know what happened after that. Captain Van Valkenburg did receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions that day. Part one, the home front here. Did he survive? He did not. I told that story this morning at the briefly. He and the quartermaster were on the bridge, the navigation bridge, when the forward magazine exploded, and there was another officer up there with them, and they all were thrown against the bulkhead, and then the fireball came through. But the officer who wrote this was pushed out the door, out of the hatch, and when he turned around and looked inside, nobody was there. They disappeared in that fireball. I know it's uplifting, sorry. The home front here in Sturgeon Bay. This one got me. We were practicing blackouts. Our warden, Rowe was his last name, was fortunate enough to have been to England and received a lot of training there on air raid warnings and precautions to take. As the new sponsoring organization for a Sea Scout ship, the line at the bottom there, which is in the newspaper here, they had trained all the Boy Scouts in Sturgeon Bay to be stretcher bearers in case of an air raid. So can you imagine middle school and teenagers trained to run through the rubble and put people on stretchers and take them to what was the hospital then, or what was going to be the hospital in the air raid, which was basically right up here in Jefferson in Michigan. Lots of cool stories, lots of millions of rabbit holes in the last few weeks. This is in the Latham Smith newspaper, shipyard newspaper. Hats off to Howard Nelson, who purchased $800 worth of war bonds during 1942. He requested 50% of his salary in bonds. That's a grand thing you've done, Howard, but don't look now. Right behind you is one of your fellow workers named Tony Schmelzer. Tony has purchased a bond every week for the past 3 months and intends to give you a run for your money, basically. So that was one thing, just a funny note about what people were doing. Rationing happened everywhere. Ration books were being distributed at area schools. So this was a note in the newspaper for that.
And there are stories profiled on the 5th floor of the tower here at the museum about the women who came to work in the shipyards. Dorothy LaPlante was a girl welder. A 1939 graduate of Sevastopol High School. Badge number 1846 as a welder in the Maritime plate shop. There was another article that I saw and then bypassed and then wish I could have gone back and found, but I couldn't find it. It was about a couple of welders, one of them male, one of them female. They met, fell in love, and got married in our shipyard. 2 warships launched on Saturday, and this one struck me because we launched a frigate and a PC. We're going to splash on the same day, but also that Latham Smith's Half Moon had arrived here and made its presence known. And if you don't know, that ship later sank and took Latham Smith. We were a busy town. The population of this town exploded. There were bus lines running back and forth to Green Bay 24 hours a day to keep the almost 5,000 shipyard workers coming and going 24 hours a day. They launched another line that went down the lakeshore to Kewanee and Algoma to bring people to the shipyards as well. But this place was just the hustle and bustle of everything in Northeast Wisconsin. 9,400 miles of welding rod used in the shipyards. The date of this article was January 45, so the war was winding down. So we probably used over 10,000 miles of welding rod in putting these ships together. We're not even at 13,000 now. And we got bigger than that before things shrunk down. This one, 1942, the city had already earned a reputation with the military. High praise for the quality of ships being turned out in this city for both the Army and the Navy has been rewarding the efforts of local shipbuilders, their employees, and production schedules are at expectations or better from Sturgeon Bay. It says a lot about the people of this community and this county. Stories of the ships. These are where the rabbit holes got really, really crazy. We will start with PC 496. It is a 461 class patrol boat with a crew of 65. These are 173 feet long. The tugboat out here is 149-ish, so a little bit longer than that, with a beam of 23, about the same width across as their tugboat. 343 of these were built in 11 different American shipyards. Latham Smith built 42 of them. 46 of those 300 plus were transferred to 20 of our allied nations and 8 were lost in action. And we'll talk about a couple of them from here that were. PC 496 was launched on November 22nd, 1941, weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Door County Advocate on the right-hand side there said, first Navy craft built here to leave to join World War II, and that was PC 496. And that happened January 23rd of 42. Here's another photo of PC 496. Now, back in this one, if you look at that very strange shaped photograph on the right, you can see that there's a tugboat behind it. It is the John Rowan III. And if anyone knows where in Sturgeon Bay that is, looks like it's down by the canal, but and she's obviously done. She's ready to go, but there's a lot of crates and stores on the shore that probably need to be loaded. But there's also lots of young ladies on the ship, so I don't know. It's got to be right before they left to go to the front lines. There's a picture of her at sea. The big push for this particular ship came in April of 43 when she crossed with a convoy of LCIs. They're a landing craft, flat bottom. They like to bounce around on the ocean. But she escorted them along with several other ships from Norfolk across a 4,000 plus mile long crossing to North Africa. And she first made her first port call at Beni Saf, a little fishing village in northern Algeria. And then she started doing operations in the southern Mediterranean and slightly moving east. She was visiting the port of Oran in Algeria. All hands had liberty. And she eventually tied up in what's called a torrid little harbor of Arzu. Some of the crew have stories. there was a PC Patrolcraft Sailors Association where a lot of these sailor stories got documented. And what ones I was able to find in relation to ships that we built are where we get some of the color commentary on this. There was an air raid in ours new at one point, and ships don't stay at the dock in that. They get underway and get out where they can defend themselves better. So the captain wasn't on board, but the crew took the ship out anyway. And they went out, and in between air raids, they came back, slowed down, and the skipper jumped on the boat before they went back out again. Sailor on board this ship by the name of Barber hated the heat, he said. I hated it. It was a great relief to get underway. Not that it was any cooler out there, but at least the air was moving by us on the water. In port, we would run hoses over the deck plates 24 hours a day just to try and cool them off, but it didn't help much. And again, the air when we got to sea was just as hot. 496 was then ordered east to the very protected port of, and I'm murdering these names, sorry, of Bizerte, which is over there by Tunis in the yellow circle. So in the northern end of Tunisia, there was a French naval base there that was occupied by the US Army at the time. And that's where this patrol craft started to do its patrols. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1943, 496 was returning from a patrol when an explosion happened. Seaman Brown was on lookout on the bridge when the blast went off. He immediately ran around, opened the life jacket storage lockers. To him, it became obvious within seconds that the ship was mortally stricken, and he cut loose the 10-man life raft on the starboard side. He told the reporter, "There I was in the water. I saw Chief Bloodworth, and there were others that were able to get on the raft. I saw fire hoses draped over the side, and I guess some of the sailors used those to get down in the water with us. Like Reuben Askew, the officer's steward. I remember him standing on the ship saying, 'I can't swim.'" Oh. Our other sailor, Mr. Barber, that was interviewed for this, was off watch at the time and asleep in his rack when the explosion happened. He talked about racing up the ladder of the companionway just forward of the thwartship's passage between the pilot house and the main superstructure. And he said, quote, "I cut right, expecting a 6 to 8 foot drop into the water. Instead, it was 6 inches to a foot from my feet. So I stepped off into the very warm water. I was shocked at how fast I was there. That's how fast our ship was going down." So the 496 sank by the stern in less than a minute. Out of her crew of 65, 10 survived. The sailors we heard from in this were obviously 2 of those. They reported that it seemed like many, many hours they spent in what they called the warm, toasty water until other patrol craft came along and rescued them. Those other patrol craft were not built here. These are the rabbit holes you go down when you're looking for this. The Navy reported this as the ship had hit a mine. But years later, Carter Barber, one of the sailors that we heard from in this, reported to the Navy that he had heard from some friends in the Italian Navy. Now, how did Carter Barber have friends in the Italian Navy? But he apparently did. But he had been told that it was an Italian submarine that sank PC-496 with a torpedo, and that captain was brought up on court-martial and charged for wasting a valuable torpedo on a small, worthless American ship. Sadly, I can find nothing to support Carter's story. So we have our first sea story of the PCs built here, but it's a good one. It's a good one. The USS Brunswick, a Tacoma-class frigate, much larger than the PCs and the subchasers. This ship had a crew of nearly 200, more than 300 feet long and almost 40 feet across. Brunswick was laid down on 16 July 1943 at Latham Smith. She was launched on the 6th of November of 43, and the Navy didn't have a crew to commission her. So they got a skeleton crew on her and took her to Texas, where she sat. She was in a reduced commission capacity until the Coast Guard was able to assemble a crew for the Brunswick. She went into full commission in October of 1944 with a 100% Coast Guard crew. I want to serve with those 3 guys on the lower right.
Which one's Val?
I mean, look, that's the team, that's the crew commissioning photo and the commissioning brochure program, if you will. And yet they stepped out from behind and made sure that they made history and they were going to be in that picture. I call them a trio of pranksters, and they were probably the best people to go on Liberty with, and also the hardest working people on the ship. They made sure they got in the history books. Brunswick service history was a busy first year of service. Brunswick went on the first of 3 round-trip convoy missions from the middle United States, most likely Virginia, to North Africa, steaming from Hampton Roads and to Oran, Algeria, same place our earlier PC went. She went there with Convoy 63 on 28 December of 1944. So that's successfully getting a convoy to North Africa. Now you got to come home empty. Well, they didn't have quite as good an experience going back. On 2nd of January 1945, they left out of Oran in the screen of Convoy 63. Right after they passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, took a turn to the south. The merchant ship SS Henry Miller suffered a torpedo hit from a German submarine U-870. Brunswick ran several depth charge attack runs, but the U-boat escaped. Brunswick then escorted the damaged Henry Miller back to Gibraltar and then rejoined the convoy. She and the rest of the convoy made it safely back to Hampton Roads on 20 January 45. So between early February and June of 45, Brunswick escorted merchant ships on 2 more round-trip convoys from Hampton Roads to North Africa. That is 16,380 miles without losing a ship. And sadly, just a couple of years after the war ended, she became, right when the war ended, a weather ship, and then she was scrapped in 47. The Evansville, another Tacoma class frigate with a crew of 190. These may have happened for all the ships here, but this is the only one that seems to be out there. You get this day of launching or day of commissioning special commemorative envelope and stamps from the Postal Service. So this is everything about her launching on November 27th, 43 in Sturgeon Bay at Latham Smith. It's fantastic, really cool postal commemoration. So Evansville left here and steamed down the Mississippi River. After calling at Mobile, she got to Charleston on 31 December of 44. Over the next 6 months, she had convoy and escort duty along the United States East Coast to Bermuda, patrolled for U-boats off the coast of New York, and served briefly as a weather ship on ocean weather stations after the war, or during the war, because Evansville has a really interesting history. She was identified as a ship in month 7 and assigned to Project Hula. Did anyone here ever hear of Project Hula? I didn't either. She was assigned to Project Hula, which was a secret program for the United States to transfer our Navy ships to the Soviet Union in trying to convince the Soviet Union to conduct a land invasion of Japan. Again, this was secret. So Evansville departed New York City on the 9th of July at 45, transited the Panama Canal, went to San Diego, Seattle, Washington State, and then to Cold Bay, Alaska, on the Aleutian Islands, which was the secret training base for Operation Hula, Project Hula. After the war, in 1946, the U.S. started to negotiate trying to get some of these ships back. And there's, I think there's 430 something ships that we gave to the Soviet Union. 480 ships that we gave to them. So we started trying to get it back. That's where Cold Bay is, in case you wanted to know. You see why they did it there. A little bit more on Project Hula. April 45, a Soviet freighter slipped into a pier at Cold Bay. It had 500 Soviet sailors aboard the freighter. And they were there to train on the 149 vessels that had been assembled by the United States Navy for transfer to the Soviet Union. A lot of those ships were built in Sturgeon Bay. That fleet's secret mission was to get the Red Army to assist in the invasion of Japan. Project Hula ended on September 4th of 45, and the Soviets, surprise, did not return all the ships and had to be pressured to return the ones they did. 4 years and 2 months after Project Hula ended, the Soviet Union sailed EK-30, the former USS Evansville, into United States Navy base at Yokosuka, Japan, and said, "Here you go." And they left. So what do you think happened to the Evansville that we got back unexpectedly, delivered to our Navy base in Yokosuka, Japan? A ship built to fight the Japanese. It was one of the first Japanese warships in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. She was the Japanese defense ship Kayaki, PF-295, sorry. After 26 years of service in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, she was returned to the United States in 1976, where she was scrapped a year later. Yeah. All right, PCs 825 and 1561 really don't have these crazy wartime records, but their stories in the newspaper popped out as being really interesting. The first one, PC 825, was purchased. Anyone here in Elk? Part of the Elks Lodge? Well, that's who paid for this ship, Wisconsin Elks. They bought or raised money for $1.5 million worth of war bonds to finance the construction of this ship. And then they held their state convention in Sturgeon Bay to socialize with the crew and see this ship off. And you know, on the left, there's another little story buried in a box there about a Smith subchaser setting a record getting to the Gulf of Mexico under its own power. Got to look and see what that was about, because they used to float them down there on barges and other floats. Well, turns out that was PC 1561, built for the Free French Navy at Latham Smith. Who here speaks French? All right, we're going to call it the Dagger. So the Dagger, PC 1561. The wife of the Chicago representative of the French Committee for National Liberation was here to christen the Dagger after a brief ceremony in which the French flag and the American flags were raised and the national anthems played here in Sturgeon Bay. She departed Sturgeon Bay with her all-French crew, and they went down the Illinois and Mississippi River system, never tying up at a pier. When they needed to take a rest, they put a line around a tree. Frenchman. And you can imagine having a bunch of French sailors in town. There were some stories about that. This photograph of two of the French sailors, they are Georges, whose rank is equivalent to that of a machinist mate third class, and then Andre, a master at arms, who won the Croix de Guerre with distinction as a gunner's mate on a destroyer at Dunkirk. These guys didn't have to buy any drink while they were here. There's a story of another French sailor and no pictures, and they only use his first name, Jean. Jean was 26 and had spent 9 years in the French Navy. He has seen a different phase of the war. This is lifted straight from the Advocate newspaper, this text here. After his French destroyer was sunk by the Germans, Jean was demobilized and sent home under orders to go to a German labor camp. He fled to Spain, was interned in prison there for 8 months, was released with 5 fellow prisoners. 5 fellow prisoners went to New Orleans waiting on this ship to arrive so they could go back to France and go back to war. It's a great story. I couldn't find any French records of this ship and what it may or may not have done, but it's interesting. I had no idea that we had French sailors here, free French, manning the ships that we built to take them back to Europe. All right, let's go to the Pacific. In the USS Grinnell, PC 1230. After commissioning in 43, she was assigned to training in Miami and Key West, and then given convoy duty between Key West and Guantanamo Bay. They probably thought that was a good gig, and then they got sent to the South Pacific. PC 1230's very first mission was to escort a commercial tug towing a floating machine shop to the advanced naval base at Bora Bora in the Society Islands. She arrived 13 February 44. In the Society Islands, they were assigned to a wide assortment of escort and convoy duties throughout the South Pacific. This duty took them to Bougainville, Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons and the Marshall Islands made landfall at Inawata and Kwajalein. In the Palos Islands, during the invasion of Peleliu, they had harbor control duties and supplied firepower for troops ashore. So 1230 was busy in the South Pacific. This was her working area, more than 10,000 miles wide, and all the different places that she went and the conflicts she was involved in. In between, seeing action between these islands, she had patrol assignments, like I mentioned, throughout other islands in the South Pacific. So she had a great record. She was awarded a battle star for her participation in the Western Carolina Island operations and the capture and occupation of Peleliu. So after VJ Day, they remained in the Far East, where they were told they were now the harbor control ship for Tokyo Bay. Knowing a formal surrender is coming up, they were probably pretty excited about what lay ahead for them. This is the history she almost made. PC 1230 was supposed to be one of the small ships to escort the battleship Missouri into Tokyo Bay for the formal surrender ceremony. But in the weeks before that, 1230's engines broke down. And instead of escorting the Missouri into Tokyo Bay, she limped to Subic Bay for repairs and didn't get back to Tokyo Bay until after the surrender. She was decommissioned in spring of 1946. Enter stage left, PGM 32 with functioning engines, also built in Sturgeon Bay. PGM 32 was commissioned in 1945 and immediately sent to the Pacific Theater after a training school in Miami and Key West. 7 months later, she replaced PC 1230, whose engines were being repaired, on her very historic assignment to escort the battleship Missouri into Tokyo Harbor for the surrender to take place. There were two brothers that served on this ship, and one of them went to great pains to get aboard to serve with his brother. But after that great news, their luck changed. They were sent to Bikini Atoll and to participate in Operation Crossroads there. The crew remained aboard the ship, where they were subjected to 2 nuclear explosions while they were aboard. They wrote about it. One of the brothers wrote about it. We sailed for the Bikini Atoll, and once we arrived, we anchored for several days. They got ready to drop the atomic bomb. We pulled up anchor and sailed in a circle about 11 miles from where the bomb exploded. And on the 25th of July, a second and final test was performed when they blew this bomb up 90 feet underwater. This test created a 900-foot base surge of falling water, which rolled over many of the target ships, painting them with radioactivity that could not be removed. They would not let us look at the explosion or take any pictures. I was shocked at how quiet it was, but you could feel it. I remember looking up at the mushroom cloud rise into the air and thinking that it would eventually cover us up. But following the underwater detonation that occurred, the former sailors recalled then, they sailed back into the target area where the scientists were. These scientists came aboard their ship and began taking samples of the water and testing the ship for lingering radiation. After a day or two, they put a Geiger counter on us. After a day or two, they put a Geiger counter on the crew members. They told us we had to abandon ship because of the amount of radiation in the bilge. So they took us to a transport carrier, and we stayed there about 5 days. And we'd have to go back aboard the ship to stand watch for 3 hours at a time. That's the end of his story. Just ended right there. Subchaser 1031. These subchasers are smaller than the PCs that I've been previously mentioning. The PCs are built of steel. These subchasers were smaller and they were built of wood. They were built at Peterson. 20 of these subchasers were built at Peterson. 7 went to Russia in Project Hula. 7 others went to the United States Coast Guard, and 6 remained in service with the Navy. Subchaser 1031 is one of those, and despite being 60 feet shorter than a PC and having a much smaller crew, her operating area was what you see in that red circle. Patrol Craft Sailors Association had conducted interviews with sailors' family members who served aboard 1031. And many of the letters that those family members had saved from their fathers or grandfathers that served on this ship said that the ship saw action in the Aleutian Islands up north, and the Gilbert and Marshall Islands in the extreme South Pacific. So this little wooden ship went everywhere and did everything. Then in 1943, Bob Fisk Jr. reported aboard this ship. Bob Fisk was a junior sailor, and despite the ship's initial action record and its huge patrol zone, when he got there, things changed. The ship was at Pearl Harbor, and this story that I'm about to read was told by Bob Fisk's son. Dad said the skipper of Subchaser 1031 was gung-ho and wanted back in the action as quick as possible. Apparently the ship had seen plenty and he wanted back in it, but the ship was brought back to Pearl for unknown reasons. Well, the gung-ho skipper didn't like that and got transferred to a different ship. He was gone. The new skipper was there the next day. This was a good guy. Apparently was friends with the admiral. Talked his way into us making milk run patrol duty around the Hawaiian Islands. Dad would call this, and his shipmates, this is what they did most of the time, and he called it the precursor to McHale's Navy. This ship was sent on missions to supply troops at the Marshall Islands and many more. He did say it was very sobering. The Hawaiian Islands were very lush and pristine, but Dad always said the Marshalls and the other islands they went to were devastated. No palm trees, little vegetation. He said the islands looked like the surface of the moon. War isn't pretty. He recalled seeing other combat ships limp into Pearl Harbor by their pier, some listing so badly they were hardly afloat. He said you could hear the ship's activity aboard there, the hammering, the welding, the cutting of steel as the ship went by and made their way into the dry dock. He would always make sure that I knew about 90% of the shipyard workers were Japanese Americans, and he'd go out of his way to point out that there was no internment camp on Hawaii. Dad said their welds looked like they'd been put on with a butter knife, they were so smooth. And often those damaged ships were repaired and put back to sea, usually in 3, maybe 4 days. He didn't see combat, but he said his time on 1031 was a precursor to McHale's Navy. They had a dog on the boat. The captain owned a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. My dad owned an Indian motorcycle, and they decided to put their motorcycles on the stern of the ship and carry them from island to island and go exploring on those motorcycles everywhere they went. He remembers that an officer walked by them on the pier one day and ordered them to get those motorcycles off what's supposed to be a combat vessel. But the captain didn't do it. My father said that he was lucky and counted his blessings. He loved his time on 1031, and he helped train the Russians when he turned it over to them. So we see that story pop up again. Then there's 1261. Back to the European theater. Steel-hulled PCs with a crew of 65. PC 1261 was built at Latham Smith, launched November of 42, well, laid down in November of 42 and launched into the icy waters in February of 43. After training and crew familiarization at the Great Lakes, she operated in the Canadian Atlantic coast, escorting merchant ship convoys, and she crossed the Atlantic and began training on the English coast for her role in the landings at Normandy as a beach control vessel. She was assigned to lead the swarms of landing craft through mine-swept channels to their designated beaches. PC 1261 was eventually assigned to the red sector of Utah Beach and spent over a month working closely with U.S. Navy APAs, those large ships in the small photograph, and with honed their communication and coordination skills in preparation for the assault on Normandy. This is a narrative from Lieutenant Commander Renzi Sewell, commanding officer PC 1261, on early morning hours of June 6, 1944. When the initial wave of troop boats arrived, we proceeded to the beach. The weather was rough, but they stuck with us. We proceeded. Very little occurred. Upon reaching about 5,000 yards from the beach, the coastal batteries opened fire on us with shells that seemed to hit about 30 yards off the starboard quarter. Remember that for pictures to come. 30 yards off the starboard quarter. I knew immediately that they had our range, and the next round would probably hit us, which it did. It hit us right on the starboard side aft midships. Ship immediately took a 20-degree list to starboard with the fantail underwater. I did not give the order to abandon ship, as we felt we might be able to save it. However, 2 minutes later, the ship took a 90-degree roll and the order was given to get off. All hands walked over the side as if you were walking on a treadmill. We all realized it was impossible for anyone to pick us up at this time, and as the waves of boats passed us by, we had no specific job to do. We did not want to stop them. We cheered them on. We knew eventually we'd get picked up. CG-16, an 83-foot patrol boat, was part of Rescue Flotilla 1 at D-Day. She was not built here. Their crew took many pictures that day. This is one they took of an unknown U.S. Navy patrol craft being range fired by German artillery. You remember the captain at 1261 said it was about 30 yards off their stern quarter. Look where these explosions are to that ship. There's nothing that says this is 1261 other than that conjecture. But CG-16 did pick up survivors from 1261. So that documentation is there. So it could be, but we don't know. This is the story as told by a Coast Guardsman aboard CG-16 that day. The control ship for Utah Beach, USS PC-1261, was obliterated when an artillery shell slammed into its starboard side, instantly killing half the crew. 1261 had led the first wave of landing craft ashore and was the first Allied ship sunk on D-Day. With shell fire peppering the water around CG-16 and the explosions of nearby mines rattling the decks beneath our feet, the Coast Guard crew began plucking survivors out of the oil-slicked waves. Upon spotting 2 injured Allied soldiers in the water, Petty Officer Swerk leapt off the cutter, swam 40 yards through enemy gunfire, fastened a rescue line around the guy, and started pulling him back to the boat. The 16 returned to a hospital ship with more than 90 wounded on her deck. CG-16 rescued 126 people that day, and every one of the 13 crew members aboard received the Navy and the Marine Corps Medal for heroism. So they did pick up the crew of 1261. This is where 1261 is. There are 2 islands off of Utah Beach, off that part of France. They were not defended by Germans. And somewhere in the water, on the upper right-hand side of that picture, halfway between these islands and that beach, is where PC-1261 sits in 80 feet of water. As Andrea points out, that's diveable.
That's so diveable.
I know. These are Napoleon-era forts that were on these islands. There's a whole other side story to that. This is actually where the first American troops were on the ground in France on that morning. That's like 0400 that morning. They put a crew of 6 in rubber dinghies that went aground here thinking there would be German guns, and there weren't any. All right, LT-145. That is the tug Butterfield / John Purvis that is right outside the window here. Crew of 30, single boiler, steam engine, 142 feet long, 28 feet across. Man, she could really go fast at 12 knots. 2 20-millimeter machine guns was the only armament she had in World War II. When she was LT-145, she sailed from Duluth, Minnesota to her wartime home port of Seattle via the Panama Canal. And her wartime assignment was to tow barges of ammunition and supplies to the U.S. military outposts on the Aleutian Islands, most likely including Cold Bay. She was returned to the Great Lakes at the end of the war in 45. She earned the American Campaign Medal, Asia Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. Now, LST-1006 was not built in Sturgeon Bay, but she was decommissioned, sent for scrap, purchased by a company called Steel Powers, and then some guy by the name of Captain John Rowan went to Texas and brought her back here, turned her into a barge, and said, these are 2 pretty good diesel engines, so he put them in storage. So he started towing this barge around, which used to be LST-1006. And then in 1957, he purchased the tug Butterfield, which was steam powered with a single steam engine. And he said, I got these 2 great diesel engines. So he put those 2 great diesel engines in the tugboat John Purvis. So we go aboard the tug Purvis, know that as a ship, she was doing her duty in the North Pacific, taking supplies to the Aleutian Islands outposts, but the engines in her engine room were at Okinawa, the assault on Okinawa, the Layette landings, and several other smaller ones that I wasn't real familiar with, but they have been to the front lines. Well, this is at the end, and it's already gone a little long, but it's important. Door County's honor roll in 1945 had 34 gold stars on it. PFC Eric Bongle, age 25. PFC George Nelson, 20. Seaman First Class, Milton Shawley, all at the tail end of the war. Their families here heard the news of what had happened to them. Roland Blahnik, age 21, killed in Okinawa. In Brussels, the Blahniks received the telegram there from the War Department. Their son was killed in Okinawa on June 28th. Many of you probably have heard this name before. Francis Tchaikovsky, two-term mayor of Sturgeon Bay after he came back. In doing this, I realized in reading about him for his Silver Star on Tarawa and Bronze Star for his action in Saipan and two-term mayor and became the postmaster here, that he was also a commanding officer with the Marine Corps on the island of Formosa during the Korean War. My stepdad, who was a Marine, was on the island of Formosa during the Korean War as a staff sergeant, and I'm pretty sure they probably knew each other. Lieutenant Gene Gislason was awarded the Silver Star as commanding officer of USS LCI 94 while landing assault troops on Normandy on June 6, 44. He did miraculous things that day, navigating the ship even after it had gotten hit and had all sorts of damage. And for his coolness under fire and excellent seamanship, he overcame all the difficulties and enabled LCI to continue active for 3 more weeks along the shoreline there. And he is from Sturgeon Bay. He lived right out here on the east side. And I noted in his obituary that it says he served as director of the Maritime Museum in Sturgeon Bay. Did not know that. George Harris, missing in the Pacific. George from Sturgeon Bay was on USS Indianapolis. Indianapolis is the ship that brought the atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan, and on the way back, it was torpedoed and sunk. The loss of more than 800 of her crew, including 23 sailors from Wisconsin and George Harris from here. 8,000 Wisconsinites would go on to lose their lives in fighting in World War II, at least 67 of those from Door County. We're right at 45 minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments, I will do my best to answer them about some of this. And I also have the rabbit hole stories. Any questions from our online folks or in the room? I really wanted to tie it up in a much happier note. Yes, sir.
Question about how you said some of the ships that were built here sailed down the Mississippi. What was the course to get them to the Mississippi, the Chicago Canal?
Through the Illinois River, right? What?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, exactly. How did the ships built here, if they went down the Mississippi, went to the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi, how did they get there? From what I read, it was the Illinois River to the Mississippi, but they were usually barged or on floats, which was interesting.
Big ships. I mean,
Big
that's not a
ships.
big waterway there.
I guess it's due to the draft. And I am not, there are people in this room who are smart enough to understand how you could put a ship that weighs 200 tons on floats and it only draws 6 feet as opposed to drawing 13 on its own going down. But that's what they did. And apparently that French PC was the first one that went down not on floats or a barge. Yes, sir.
Latham Smith become Bay ship.
It's the same facility, yes. Did Latham Smith become Bay Ship? It's the same facility, same grounds, same shipyard. Yes, ma'am.
So overall, how many ships were built?
Almost 400 is the closest number. There's slight, did some ships go to the combat or not? And there's a couple different lists, but it's easy to say at least 400 from here were military vessels during the war. Yes, sir.
How did the shipbuilders get these contracts? Were they bidding on? Bidding on these contracts?
How did the shipyards win these contracts? Were there bids going on just like there are today? Yes. There were bids going on the same way, and some of the same things we read in the newspaper today, some of the same sentences were in the Advocate back then. That a new project with a new type of ship was announced, and contracts they're bidding them out now. And the shipyards here were all over trying to win those. So it's been the same way.
So those almost 400 ships you're talking about, they were built from when, 41 to 46?
They wound down at 45 at the beginning. Yeah, I don't think they built any. I didn't see any that were launched in 46. They were decommissioning and scrapping ships for that.
So it's about a
So-
4-year period.
There's probably an entire novel to be written on what happened at the end of the war when the brakes got put on. As you look at all those pictures of 5,000 people working in the shipyards here and all of those buses and everybody here, and then all of a sudden, wait, we don't need it anymore. It probably had to be an economic shock to the community for sure. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question. Yes, sir.
If you look at the map of where the World War II was going on, Pacific and Africa, Jersey Bay is about the furthest place away to build a ship. Were we that good at that time, or why was it?
Question, when you look at a map of where all the conflict was in World War II, Sturgeon Bay is about as far away from any of that as you can get. Were we that good at building ships? I think we were that good at building ships, but I think more importantly, they needed everybody building ships. And if there was a community that was capable, they maximized the capability of that community. There were communities building ships that had no business building ships. I lived in Decatur, Alabama for a few years. They were building warships in World War II. And they probably had to get them out on the Tennessee River. They may have built 5, not the hundreds that we did here, but every community that could was doing it then. I did stumble across a graphic in the newspaper that I almost put in here, and I'll mention it real quick. It was the number of military service people killed in the first year of the war versus the number of civilian defense workers killed on the assembly lines in the first year of the war. And it was startling. 6,000 American dead service people, 42,000 dead in construction of war materials. And that number just got crazier and crazier as the war went on. So this was not, OSHA didn't exist. So they did what they needed to do to get these ships built. I don't believe anybody took advantage of anybody, but they were working with the best they had at the time. And the important thing was to get these ships out there to defeat the people who wanted to defeat us. Let me push through these real quick because they're really cool. If you need to leave, I will not be offended if you get up and leave.
Okay, I was gonna say, this next part is completely optional.
This is optional.
I do highly recommend staying, this is pretty cool stuff.
I'll roll through it really quick.
Now's a great time to depart if you're done.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not so much a question, but you did mention it all, Sturgeon Bay Boat Works. They also built ships during the war years.
Who?
Sturgeon Bay Boat Works.
They did. Lots and lots of smaller boats, rescue boats and things like that. The documentation of what they did when they left here, not able to find online. We would have to go to the archives of the Navy or the Army to dig up the small boat records. So that was, I looked for those, absolutely not out there online to find, but they did.
And they won the Army Navy.
Several of the yards did, they did. This was known as the place, even though it was far away from everything, this was known as the place that could build ships. PC in 1942, PC 1264 was one of 2 ships in the United States Navy that had an all African-American crew. It was a test. So they enlisted complement during the war. A destroyer, the USS Mason, did the same thing. 1264 was in service less than 2 years. The performance of her crew and that of the Masons led the Navy to reevaluate the perception of African-American members and allow them to join the fleet. This is a sad picture. This is that ship. This is in the water between New York and New Jersey. PC 1264, one of the first 2 all African-American staffed crewed ships in the United States Navy, is just falling apart and deteriorating in the waters at Don John Iron and Scrap Metal Processing Facility in New York. that PC had the very first commissioned African-American naval officer on board her. That was this man who rose to become Vice Admiral Samuel Gravely Jr., serving from 1942 to 1980, and he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and he was the third senior officer on that ship. The first two, the captain and the XO, were white. That time, Ensign Gravely did become, right at the end of the war, the XO of the PC. And then there's PC 566. She was coming out, she was escorting two freighter and passenger ships out of New Orleans. And in the early years of the war, 42, and one of those ships was torpedoed and sunk. PC 566 ran several depth charge runs. They saw an oil slick. They saw damage. They saw some pieces of debris in the water. Let the Navy know exactly what they did, and the Navy said, nah, we don't think you got a U-boat. The next day, a Coast Guard aircraft flew over and said, hey, we see a U-boat, and they dropped bombs on it, and they got credit for destroying the U-boat that sank the ship that was under escort by 566. Fast forward 70-something years later, Shell Oil Company is doing a survey in the Gulf of Mexico, and they find that freighter 200 yards off her stern is a U-boat snapped in half. So 566 got the credit. You're looking at the son of the captain of 566 receiving a Navy Commendation Medal for taking that U-boat out back in 1942. Navy doesn't always get it right, but eventually they figure it out. Yes.
You're forgetting the best part of that story. Didn't he have to go back to school? Didn't they?
Yes, the Navy sent him back to school to learn how to destroy submarines.
Wow.
Yeah, how many of you were in the Navy with me? That's not surprising, is it? No. There's only one subchaser PC type ship left that anyone can find. It is an active duty military vessel in the Norwegian Navy. It was not built in Sturgeon Bay, sadly. But she's an active duty ship, not as a combatant. She's an active duty ship much in the same way our USS Constitution is. So in the summer, they sail her up and down the northern European coasts and do tours, and they stop in various communities and give tours and talk about the history of Subchaser 497. So if you ever find yourself in Norway, do it in the summer and try and track down, what's her name? Yes.
And then I will have you back to do a speaker series about that.
No. That's all I have. Any other questions? Here.
Named also to keep in memory, a local resident by the name of Lloyd Berg was in the radio room of the battleship Missouri while the surrender was taking place above 2 decks above him.
Wow.
And his daughters took a tour. They got to the radio room where their father served and asked the tour guide if they could get in there and explain if this is their father who